Good morning. Good to see you all. Pleased you're here. If you want to mark in your hymn books, if you're following the book, the Song of Invitation will be number 422. Number 422, Jesus Saves, will be the Song of Invitation. It's good to see so many of you back. Some of you I haven't seen in a while. That's no fault of yours or mine. Things happen, right? Like last year. But it's good to see so many. It's good to see the Malones back, as well as the Wagners and the Avinas, and so many of you who have, including the Brewers, who have forgotten you. It's all my fault. I do want to apologize to the children who may have had the worksheet this morning. I had pre-vacation brain and spaced my topic, and I planned something else this morning. So I'm going to promise you right now, we will be doing the church next week. This morning, I'm going to ask you to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. We'll be looking at the first similitude that Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, and that's found in verse 13 of Matthew chapter 5. Driving up to Oregon this last week, Paco had told me that if you start nodding off, you need to have sunflower seeds when you're driving. And I didn't quite believe it at first, and sure enough, driving from Tucson to Redding, California, and one day, about Sacramento, I start nodding off, and so I had picked up some sunflower seeds and popped into my mouth. And sure enough, it does keep you awake. But the thing I was thinking about as I'm eating those sunflower seeds is, man, these are really salty, and I really like this taste. Salt has that distinctiveness to it, does it not? It's no wonder why then Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13 says this of his people. He says of kingdom citizens, "You are the salt of the earth. But the salt has become tasteless. How can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." You know, if those sunflower seeds didn't have any salt, because you chew on them for a little bit, they become tasteless. That really doesn't keep you awake at that point. That's when you need to spit them out. They're not good for anything. But the fact that they're salty, in addition to trying to get the kernel or the seed out of the shell, is what keeps you awake. And Jesus' point here is salt is so distinct, so unique, that Christians are to be like it. For us, I would say this may be a similitude that we have a hard time wrapping our heads around. But for us, we can go to Safeway and buy salt by the pound, and it's dirt cheap. But for most of human history, salt wasn't quite worth its weight in gold, but it was pretty close. In fact, in this country, there is the Republic of Texas actually went to war with some of the other colonies around them for control of certain salt flats in order to control it. In ancient Rome, a legionnaire's salary could be paid in salt in times of economic distress. It was that valuable. And before refrigeration, salt was the main way to preserve meat. So we want to consider this morning, why does Jesus compare Christians to salt? Now, these are not the only things salt does, but salt does at least 4 things that Christians ought to embody if we're to be the salt of the earth that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. So starting off with the first one is not so much something salt does, but what salt is, and that is, it is distinct. It has a distinct nature or a taste to it. There's no other seasoning or spice on the earth like salt. It's essential and necessary in all modern cooking. For example, if a dish is seasoned right, which includes salt, you'll hardly taste it. But if you leave the salt out, it doesn't matter how well you season the rest of the dish, it's worthless. This is something I don't bake a whole lot, okay? I prefer grilling meats, pulled pork, that kind of stuff. But I didn't know salt is an essential ingredient in making chocolate chip cookies. That was news to me. And no wonder every time I try making them on my own, they didn't come out quite right. I took a bite of one, it's like, yeah, this is sweet, but there's something missing. Or who here has had a steak that was not seasoned properly? If you over-season it, all you can taste is the seasoning. If you under-season it, well, it's just a charred piece of meat, which I don't know about you, but I'm still okay with that. but salt is distinct. So Christians likewise ought to be distinct and set apart. Consider what God said to us through Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. 1 Peter chapter 2, 9 and 10. Peter says here, "For you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so you may proclaim the excellencies of him who have called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." We as Christians have been called out to be a unique, distinct, separate, and apart people. The second similitude in, I believe, verses 15 and 16 in Matthew chapter 5 talks about how we are to be lights, like a city set on the hill. And he uses the comparison there, when you light a light, as they did in the old days, you didn't put it underneath a basket so it didn't give light. You set up on the candle stand so the whole house may be illuminated and others could see their way by the light that was generated. You can't do that if you're like everyone else. I remember reading a sermon by Harris J. Dark. I never met the man, but I have 2 compilations of his sermons in my library. And he was talking about the need for distinctive preaching. And he had talked about how there was an article in the local paper about a preacher of the Lord's church. And he was writing that article, the preacher of the Lord's church, talking about how great it was that in that city you could go to the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the church, and the preaching all sounded the same. He said that's not how it should be. Christianity has a distinct, separate message, especially that of the unadulterated gospel. And his people ought to be a separate, distinct people that act as lights to the world. So we are to be distinct and separate. This goes on further, not only just from other religious groups, but from the world itself. Consider Romans chapter 12 for a moment, verses 1 and 2. Romans chapter 12, the first 2 verses there. Distinct from others, but distinct from the world. A Christian should not have an easy time walking or fitting in with the world. I think we touched on that a couple of weeks ago when we talked about some of the Beatitudes. The beginning of the year, of this world is not our home. We shouldn't have an easy time fitting in here. Consider what Paul said in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. He says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy and sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." I believe we've talked previously about how that word transform, we get the same English word for metamorphosis. It is a fundamental transformation, a changing of our nature, of who we are for the better. So if you go out today and lunch, whatever, a worldly person should be able to tell there's something different about you, about us. And hopefully it's not because somebody forgot to shower this morning, but because we're being lights and salt in this world. The second quality of salt that Christians need to embody is the fact that salt stings if it gets in an open wound or cut. I've heard sermons on this. This is the point I don't think gets brought up, is the fact that salt does hurt when it gets in an open wound. Now, salt has some antibacterial properties to it. Not enough where, I have a scar on my wrist here. I won't tell you how I got it. I wasn't being smart. That's all you need to know. But if I were to just take a handful of salt and just rub it in there, one, it's going to hurt a lot. Salt's abrasive. It's going to be sucking moisture out of there. It's going to hurt. But it's not enough antibacterial to actually cure that wound. But it has enough antibacterial qualities to where if you have a toothache, a sore throat, you gargle salt water. And the thing is, when you do that, there's a little bit of sting to it, especially if a canker sore and you're doing that. But afterwards, there is relief. The salt lets you know there's something wrong there. There's a wound. Christians likewise. Our presence often causes a stinging effect in the communities we live in, especially the ones deeply marred by sin. And it's not from us being ugly or obnoxious or rude or protesting everything. At least it shouldn't be. It comes from the fact that if we are truly embodying the teachings of Christ, Christians stand as a reminder to the lost world that there is a God, there is a right and wrong, and there is a coming judgment. And you are a representation of that, no matter if you say that or not. You say that you're a Christian. That immediately, for the worldly person lost in darkness, conjures up some spiritual and moral hurt on their part, some stinging. But they know in their conscience they're in the wrong. This is what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Romans chapter 1, looking at the verses 18 and 19. Paul, speaking about unbelief and its consequences, says this. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them." Now, one way God made it evident to them is through the creation. He goes down verses 20 and 21. He says, "For since the creation of the world," he continues here, "his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." So one way as God has made it evidently known to them is that you look outside. You look at the created order of things. Augustine, I'm going to paraphrase Augustine's point because I don't remember the exact quotation, but he said to the effect of, people will scour the world looking for the next great thing, but they won't give their own existence a second thought. We still have no idea, by when I say we, mankind and our speculations and our research, we still have no idea how consciousness works. There's no adequate explanation for why does this body of bone and flesh, why it moves, why it thinks, any of that stuff. And really, you can't have adequate explanations if you exclude a whole realm of knowledge that comes from God. So we see here what he said plays out. They became futile in their speculations. The second way God makes it known, evidently, one, through creation, but secondly, it's through Christians. And not necessarily for us going out and telling people about it, but just us trying to be what we ought to be. Consider what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 4, in verse 4. 1 Peter 4, and the verse is 4. Peter says here, now, for context, he speaks about in the previous verse, he talks about the time past is already sufficient for us to have engaged in all the worldly desires and sins and drunkenness and debauchery and immorality. He says that time is no longer. We need to put away that. He says in verse 4, "In all this, they," the world, "are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excess of dissipation, and they malign you." Many in the world are puzzled, sometimes outright angry, that Christians do not engage in the same, I was going to say same level, but that's not even accurate, the same types of pleasure activities, hobbies, whatever you want to put in there that the world does. I've used it before, and I'm going to use it probably 1,000,000 times before I die, that I never understood, even before I was a Christian, working 5 days, blowing your entire paycheck on a 2-day drinking binge, and then waking up Monday morning to do it again. That doesn't sound like a fun time to me. It sounds like a waste of money. I'd much rather go traveling or something. But the world looks at you kind of weird when you say, wait, you don't do that every weekend? It kind of shocked some of my friends in college when I said, yeah, I don't drink. They had to do a double take. What do you mean you don't drink? I just don't drink. Never had a desire to, don't want to. I have better things to do with my money. And oftentimes, yeah, I had some good experience, but oftentimes Christians get maligned, ridiculed because of that. Why did they do so? Why is it that people react that way? Well, I think John had something to say in John chapter 3 and verse 20. In John 3 and the verses 20, Jesus speaking of the light, he says, "For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed." I don't know how you all were as teenagers, but I was the kind that I would stay up till 2 in the morning Friday night playing my Xbox, and then I wouldn't wake up till noon. And oftentimes my mom would come in my room, and sure enough, rip open the curtains, and you have the bright daylight, shining light of day shining down upon you when you've been used to darkness all day. It hurts the eyes. Now apply that spiritually. Somebody come in contact with the genuine article of a Christian. It doesn't matter if it's, in the human mind, the smallest offense or the smallest act of immorality, it becomes evident. One last illustration on this, we'll move on to the next point. Some of you knew Rick Pintor. He passed away a couple of years ago. I had the privilege of going to his funeral. And one of the guys he worked with back in California told the story of how he started getting engaged with the gospel. And somebody correct me if I missed the details on this, but I'm fairly sure I remember the story correctly. The guy started talking about how these guys were talking in the break room, and somebody brought up the topic of hell. Said, "Oh, no, let's change I don't want to talk about that. I'm not comfortable with that." It brought up feelings of fear and everything else. And the guy responded to, "Well, let's talk about that. Instead of avoiding the subject, let's dive deeper into that. Why are you afraid of that?" Well, John 3 and verse 20. And all of us were at that point before we became Christians. Some of us more than others. If you're raised in the church, maybe you didn't have that point. But for those of us who are not raised or were lapsed or whatever, there's a point where we just don't want to talk about it because we knew what was right, but we just didn't want to acknowledge it. But Christians, we cause that kind of sting if we're trying to be the lights that God has us to be. Now, we don't want to stop at that sting. We want to bring that sting into healing through the gospel. The third thing that salt does, moving on here, is that salt preserves. The old times, before refrigeration, as I said, you would salt your meat in order to preserve it, to keep it for long periods of time. That's how you were able to have any sort of food stored up for any length of time, was salting. It has a preservative quality to it. Likewise, Christians should be an immense preservative in the communities in which they live in. Christians should be involved in school board and other things and trying to be active in their communities to try and stand up for what's right, for what's pure, what's holy, what's righteous, and do so in a loving way, but doing so in order to preserve the integrity of the community. Consider for a moment Genesis chapter 18. We're going to go all the way back to Genesis 18 with Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we know the end of Sodom and Gomorrah, but I want to note something here. We're going to look at Genesis 18, starting in verse 23. We'll read through to the end of the chapter. Abraham came near and said, he's speaking to Jehovah, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked. So the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" So the Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare the whole place on their account." And Abraham replied, "Now, behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord, although I am but dust and ashes. Suppose 50 righteous are lacking 5. Will you destroy the whole city because of 5? And he said, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." He spoke to him yet again and said, "Suppose 40 are found there." And he said, "I will not do it on account of the 40. Then he said, "Oh, may the Lord not be angry that I shall speak. Suppose 30 are found there." And he said, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." And he said, "Now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." And he said, "I will not destroy it on account of the 20. And he said, "Oh, my Lord, not be angry, and I shall speak only this once. Suppose 10 are found there." And he said, "I will not destroy it on the count of the 10. As soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place. Now, if we continue reading to 19, we find out that there were not 10 to be found. In fact, one can maybe make the argument that only one was found. It was Lot. I say that because I think you can make an argument either way for his wife and his daughters based on the actions and what they were okay with doing after that, but that's a whole nother lesson for a whole nother day. But I want to play the what if game for a moment. What if Sodom did have 10 righteous persons in it? We don't think 10's a lot. You know, I've worshiped in congregations where there was 3 of us, and I was the one guest speaking. We don't think 10 is a lot of people. But if Sodom and Gomorrah had just 10 people, it would have been spared. Now we're a congregation, I think at last count 160-something. That's far more than what Abraham ever asked. He started out with 50 and worked his way down. Consider for a moment, what kind of preservative power would a congregation of 50 have? 100, 150. If every Christian in that congregation is striving to be righteous in the sight of God. What kind of calamities have Christians prevented because they have stayed the course in difficult times? I know we're playing the what if here because I don't presume to know the mind of God, but I do know his character revealed here. He said in verse 32, "I will not destroy it on account of the 10. God is just, and God preserves and protects his people. So Christians ought to be striving to be a preservative effect in their communities. And this can be done again as we go back to time and time again, taking seriously the call of Christ, taking seriously the demands of the gospel, taking seriously the holy calling to which we have been called. Now, we tend to, I think, sometimes forget, overlook, think it's for somebody else because we emphasize, well, everyone's a priest. Well, yes, we are. We all are priests. But sometimes I feel like we can justify our lack of action by saying, well, somebody else needs to do it. Or we're all priests and not everybody can do everything at the same time, and we'll let the other people handle it. It's so important for every single Christian to take seriously the priestly calling which they have been called. All of us are responsible to offer that worship. All of us are responsible to be examples to the people, as the priests were of old. All of us have the responsibility to be examples to the world of the better way. Because the world needs a better way right now. The world needs lights and salt to show them the better way. And the final quality of salt we want to consider this morning that Christians need to embody is that salt creates thirst. We often talk about the preservative properties of salt, the unique taste of salt, sometimes even the sting of salt. But have you considered that Christians should make others thirsty? Thirsty for righteousness, thirsty for Christ. There's a reason why an ice cold Coca-Cola pairs well with French fries or a bag of Lay's potato chips. You have something super salty and you have something super thirst quenching. And so Christians ought to act as, if you'll excuse the illustration, potato chips to the world. Okay? Okay, no one's laughing. That's okay. I'm laughing. And maybe the only application and question I have for this whole sermon is, here it is, excuse me. Do others, by spending time around me, gain an increased appetite for Christ? That's really what we're talking about when salt, Christians generating thirst for righteousness, is do others, by spending time around me, want to know Jesus more? Does our conversation, is it seasoned with salt, as Paul would say? Do we give grace? Do we create this desire in others that I want to know why they're different? Why do they act the way they do? And make them pursue further, and pursue Jesus further than what perhaps they've already. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. 1 Peter 3, verse 15. He says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence." Notice that it's not you going around people saying, "Hey, I have this great hope," although that is legitimate. In this verse, it's Peter's saying, being ready to give an answer for the people who ask you. Not you tell them, but them asking you. Well, why are they going to ask you? There ought to be something evident in your life that makes them ask. And it can be as simple as, well, why do you go to church 3 times a week? They may say that, dismissively, but it's an opportunity. They may wonder, why do you give up your free time to go visit the elderly and the infirmed? Why are you so quick to help people? Or more basic than that, why are you a decent human being? Because I'll tell you, that's rare right now. This always puzzled me. I got praised in school, and I'm not bragging here. I'm not trying to brag here. I got praised in school for just being well-behaved, saying please, thank you, that kind of stuff. Because it's so uncommon. How much more so a genuine Christian who has the love of others in mind, who has the mind of Christ. That's even rarer than just basic human decency. But Peter says we need to be ready to give an answer for everyone who asks us for the hope that's within us. And how does that hope get brought? How is that hope there? It's because we have made Christ the epicenter of our lives. He has been set apart. That's what sanctify means. He is Lord within us. That heart there is the sum total of you. What makes you, you. Christ is Lord over that. It is by being a good representative of Christ on this earth that will make others thirst for Him. And what's interesting too, that if we get one of the first Beatitudes down, one of the first ones, Matthew 5:6, where He says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Okay, that type of hunger is also contagious. It's the only type of hunger that is contagious. I've only visited the Valley congregation for services maybe once or twice. And I try and be like Brent Phelps when I'm teaching Bible class. Because my only experience with him teaching Bible class was on Leviticus 11. And I don't know about you, before that class, Leviticus was like, oh, okay, here we go with all the purity laws. I didn't have much interest in it. He had such energy and enthusiasm for the text. We were just talking about the purification rituals the priest had to go through. Next I knew, the hour was up. I'm like, hold up. Are we done? And I wanted to dig into Leviticus. That's because Brent had such a hunger and thirst for the things of God. I'm like, I want that. He made it come alive. And that's what true hunger and thirst for righteousness can do in you to others. That type of fire, that type of zeal is contagious. So in conclusion, just kind of summarize these things. Jesus calls us the salt of the earth because, like salt, Christians are to be separate and distinct from the world. We need to remind the world of the sins, their sins, and the fact that their need of Jesus. That's how we sting. We need to act as preserving agents in the communities we live in, again, by showing the world the better way. And finally, we need to cause others who do not know Christ to hunger and thirst for Him as we ourselves hunger and thirst for Christ. I want to conclude again with that similitude in Matthew 5:13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Be salty this week. I'm going to try to. Be salts and lights in this world. Maybe you're here this morning and You're not the salt of the earth. You haven't accepted Jesus' invitation. You actually don't know anything about Jesus. We can study with you. We can teach you the gospel if you've never heard of Jesus, if you don't know anything about him, and that goes for anyone watching online. Contact us. We will sit down with you. We can study online. We can do all that to teach you the gospel. But maybe you do know who Jesus is. Maybe you do know that he came and died for you, an agonizing death on the cross for our sins. And that by belief in him and obedience to his gospel, you can have everlasting life. You know, he says in Mark 16, verse 16, right before he ascends into heaven, that he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, and he who believes not shall be condemned. On the day of Pentecost, when the 3,000 asked the apostles, what shall we do to be saved from our sins? Peter said, each one of you repent and be baptized for the remission of your sins, and you'll receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. If you are that person this morning, you need to accept the gospel. We are happy to do so. There is water ready. Maybe you've done that in the past and you're struggling. You need the prayers of strength or encouragement of the congregation. Now is the time to get right with God. Won't you come? Let's get everybody stand and sing the song of invitation.